Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the virtual planes today. Very excited to host our event with two of the most prolific and dare I say titans on Capitol Hill, advancing our national security for a number of years, advancing our cybersecurity issues. Thrilled to be able to host Congressman Michael McCaul, who represents the 10th district of the great state of Texas. Prior to becoming the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he was a longtime chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee. And prior to that was a prosecutor. So spent a lot of time working national security cases in West Texas and came to the field with a ton of operational experience, and including, if I'm not mistaken, he ran the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Texas as well. Also joining us is Congressman Langevin, who represents the 2nd District of the great state of Rhode Island. Also a longtime national security leader on Capitol Hill, currently chairs the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats in the Armed Services Committee. He also serves on the Solarium Commission, which I'm clearly biased on. I get to spend quite a bit of time with Congressman Langevin. And I mean, in all sincerity, these two members have probably been the most active, prolific, and impactful members focused on national security. So thrilled to have them here today to talk about the Cyber Diplomacy Act. This was a bill that Congressman McCaul had sponsored in the past. Thrilled to see that it's got additional bipartisan support and was reintroduced earlier this year. And Congressman McCaul, the floor is over to you. And I might note to our audience, we're going to have to cut today's session a little short due to votes, and that's why our members are where they are. So can't hold that from them. So Congressman McCaul, we'll start with you, and then we'll turn to Congressman Langevin, get into a quick Q&A. And if I can ask our audience members, if you have questions, tee them up soon so we don't lose them before the vote. So Congressman McCaul, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Frank. It's great to see you virtually. And I want to thank University for holding this important event. And I'm really glad that my good friend, Congressman Langevin, bipartisan partner in cyber, is joining us as well as we discuss our bill and the need to protect our cybersecurity abroad. I'm sure that you're aware of the news that broke last night regarding the sanctions on Russian entities related to the SolarWinds hack, which happened actually in my Boston. So this is a very timely conversation. When I did chair prioritized passing bipartisan legislation to target the cyber threats posed to our elections and cyber infrastructure by our adversaries like Russia and China. This is an American issue. I'm proud of the bill that resulted, which set up the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or what is known as CISA today. This new agency leads cybersecurity operations to protect our nation's critical infrastructures and government networks. But more still needs to be done. As we saw with SolarWinds and Microsoft breaches, our adversaries have sophisticated abilities to exploit our cyber weaknesses and conduct destructive cyber attacks globally. What's frustrating is that we could have been better prepared for these attacks. In 2014, Russia hacked the State Department's unclassified networks. Yet even with that knowledge, we were unable to rebuff this hack more than half a decade later. And that's why Congressman Langevin and I are working on mandatory breach notification legislation that will help us better identify these breaches in real time. We've also teamed up to introduce the Bipartisan Cyber Diplomacy Act, which will be on the floor for a vote next week. This bill will give the State Department the resources it needs to work with our allies and partners to address cyber security issues. I believe that setting up an ambassador at large is very important so that we have international norms and standards when it comes to cyberspace. I think together we can stop regimes like Russia and China from committing these cyber attacks and from censoring the truth. It will also establish the U.S. international cyberspace policy as well as an ambassador at large with authorities to promote shared cyber policies abroad. This is kind of the missing piece. Jim and I set up CISA to share information with the private sector. DoD and NSA is that offensive capability. Now this will address our international position. I'm proud to say that it has passed out of committee in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and we just heard the good news. It'll be up for a vote next week. So I believe it's critical we work with our allies around the world, not only to fight against our adversaries, but promote our shared goals of freedom. Cybersecurity, as I've always said, is national security. And I look forward to discussing our Cybersecurity Diplomacy Act and ways we can work together to ensure our cyberspace is protected. And Frank, thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Congressman. Great to host you again. So thank you for all your hard work. Congressman Langevin?
Well, very good. Thank you, Frank. It's great to be with you. And I just want to begin by thanking you for your unwavering commitment to cybersecurity over the years. I've known Frank for more years than I can remember, and probably more years than he wants to remember. But I can tell you, I've always relied on his counsel, and it's really been a real privilege to work with you, Frank, and certainly in particular on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission the past 2 years. And I'm delighted to see that that you brought your usual zest for particularly this particular topic to the McCrary Institute, and look forward to our discussion today. I also just want to take a minute to acknowledge the incredible leadership of my good friend and colleague, Congressman Michael McCaul. As Mike mentioned, he and I got started on our cyber journey together more than a decade ago now, and really it's been great to see the emphasis that he's put on the issue in his various leadership roles. And I'm particularly proud to be joining my voice with his and Chairman Meeks on the Cyber Diplomacy Act, an extremely important piece of legislation. And as Mike mentioned, I'm thrilled that it's going to be up on the floor for consideration and vote next week. I have no doubt it's going to pass with strong bipartisan support. I'm going to take a minute just to deviate a little from what's my original prepared remarks to address President Biden's recent actions to counter Russian aggression, since it highlights why we need such a strong whole of government approach to malicious cyber actions. So today, the president has made clear that the days of Trumpian appeasement are over, and Russia's list of malign activities is long, damning, and really and Putin really has to understand that his efforts sow chaos don't enhance Russia's standing in the world. Rather, they leave it increasingly isolated. So the administration's decision to sanction the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, is particularly noteworthy. Now, the SolarWinds incident that the administration today attributed to the SVR had all the trappings of traditional espionage that, while unfortunate, has not historically been outside the bounds of responsible state behavior. I strongly encourage the President and Secretary of State Blinken to fully explain the contours of their new policy, which seems to focus on Russian reckless history of attacks like NotPetya and the immense cleanup costs associated with SolarWinds. Now, today's actions really, though, are emblematic of the whole of government response recommended by the Solarium Commission to combat malicious cyber activity. Because my one disappointment is that they have not been announced in conjunction with our allies. So our strong network of like-minded nations is one of the greatest strengths in the face of destabilizing operations from our great power competitors. And the statements of solidarity from our NATO and EU partners, while welcome, are no substitute, of course, for strong action. So while these recent with these recent actions in mind, I just want to frame how we address cyberspace. So it's not and should not be considered exclusively through a military lens. And it resides almost entirely in privately owned and operated infrastructure. So while there is a tendency among the national security minded to label it the quote unquote fifth domain of warfighting, by doing so, we risk minimizing how other agencies influence the domain. So we can't approach cyberspace with such a one-sided understanding. We must instead leverage a whole of society approach that takes into account the cross-cutting nature of this human-made domain. So there's also a misconception that cyberspace has no norms. That's a modern equivalent of a Wild West. So sometimes it seems that way, but it really isn't the full story. Norms in the international community are both descriptive and also aspirational. The descriptive, to the extent that they identify the status quo, which what behaviors we have observed thus far and therefore can expect going forward. But norms can also be aspirational in the sense that countries negotiate policy statements that identify responsible state behavior. When that behavior reflects aspirations, norms form the rules of the road and provide effective restraint for rogue actors. So the United Nations established and agreed upon a set of aspirational cyberspace norms through the GGE in 2015. While we have agreed on the standard, though we have not worked with international partners to enforce those norms until they become as ingrained as responsible maritime behavior. So, most significantly, we consistently fail to identify, attribute, and respond to cyber incidents with the speed necessary to reinforce responsible behaviors in this domain. Time and again, it takes months, if not years, to impose punishments on states for a malicious operation. Our adversaries know this, and they take full advantage of our lethargy. So, we don't have the luxury of time on our side, unfortunately. Behavior today sets precedent for tomorrow. Irregular activity from our adversaries that deviates from our vision is already being established. And it's up to us to decide if we're going to lead or we are going to be led. So our adversaries recognize this, and they're pouring resources into international forums to make sure they have the loudest voices in the room. And up until recently, they've been winning, unfortunately. They're pursuing this parallel diplomatic efforts to compete with our priorities. Unfortunately, it's already starting to work. In 2018, the UN adopted a Russian-backed resolution creating an open-ended working group intended to undermine the work of the GGE. In 2019, Russia successfully pushed for a process to draft a new cybercrime treaty to compete with the well-established Budapest Convention, and we just can't let this happen. I'm in politics, so I know a good pivot when I see one. And here's the situation where you have our international adversaries kind of doing the bait and switch. Well, we don't have to agree to this or adhere to these norms here because we're working on this other group over here, which is going to be much better. Trust us. Well, I don't trust them, and I don't think it's going to be better. And we really do need to hold them more accountable. So these failures lie squarely, though, in a lot of ways, at the feet of the State Department. But ultimate responsibility falls more broadly. It's not that their personnel weren't trying. No, that's not the case at all. It was I was a big fan of Rob Strayer while he was at State, and he won some important victories on 5G. But in a lot of ways, he was essentially a one-man band with a tiny team, largely ignored by senior leadership. And his efforts, while admirable, were largely confined really to silos. So, and while they keep us in the conversation, these uncoordinated moves serve more as delaying actions to our adversaries' concerted efforts to shape space in their favor. So, what we need instead of a whole of government approach that can bring multiple instruments to bear to counter authoritarian pressure and lead with our democratic ideals. So, the Cyber Diplomacy Act, which Mike has introduced and I'm proud to co-sponsor, is a major step forward in defining and implementing a coherent and concerted diplomatic effort. This act reinforces our commitment to human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and with this clear vision, our leaders will be authorized to pursue those necessary objectives to clarify norms and standards, implementing commitments on responsible country behavior and reducing the risk of escalation in cyberspace. So while all facets of our government will contribute to implementing the policy, we must have a leader. Therefore, the cornerstone of the Cyber Diplomacy Act is the creation of the Bureau for International Cyberspace Policy at the State Department. Sitting underneath a senior officer at State, ideally a deputy secretary, this bureau will have the authority to speak on the cyberspace, from every perspective. By highlighting cyber in organizational structure, the Cyber Diplomacy Act positions the State Department to prioritize our cybersecurity principles on the global stage and advance our vision of an open, interoperable, and secure internet with all facets of diplomacy. Finally, and just in closing, this act equips the Bureau with the authorities, the manpower, and expertise necessary to be a global leader. No longer will our diplomats be outmatched and outnumbered at every turn. We'll bring technical and diplomatic expertise to international standard-setting bodies that effectively advocate for our interests. So the Cyber Diplomacy Act was one of the Solarium Commission's most significant recommendations and one of the biggest missed opportunities last year. Thankfully, Mr. McCaul pushed for early introduction of the bill, and Chairman Meeks ensured that it has already been marked up and favorably reported. So I have high confidence again that we are well on our way to getting this bill enacted. And with that, I just want to thank you for the great opportunity to speak with you today. If you're interested in this vital topic, and I look forward to your questions.
Congressman Langevin, thank you for a great opening statement. Covered a lot of important territory there. Congressman McCaul, I want to turn to you first, since Congressman Langevin shed some light on his views in terms of the promulgation of the executive order and the imposition of sanctions today against Russia. And I think we all can say that the bad guys have been getting away with way too much, that we have to impose cost and incur consequence on bad cyber behavior. Is this enough? And I might also ask, on the heels of this, in addition to SolarWinds, you have another advanced persistent threat, namely the People's Republic of China and the CCP, and their role allegedly in the Microsoft Exchange hack. So I expect another shoe to drop over there. I'd be curious what your thoughts are, firstly, on the immediate sanctions, and secondly, just more broadly speaking, in terms of I think the Cyber Diplomacy Act can help enable some of these pieces, but I'd be curious what your thoughts are.
Right, and I was glad to see the administration respond. For too long, Frank, as you and I have seen, and Jim, both Russia and China have gotten away with so much without any consequence at all. When the Chinese stole 23 million security clearances, including mine and I think yours, Frank, there was no
Congressman Landon.
And they got my fingerprints and everything else, but no response, no consequence, no action. Right? When North Korea hit Sony, I didn't see a whole lot of response to that. When Russia, finally, with Russia's malware, it was very deceptive, by the way. It snuck in and out of the system for a period between April and June, and they couldn't detect it until December. And then within 2 days, Microsoft and FireEye developed the kill switch to this very sophisticated malware. So I was very pleased to see the president respond with the sanctions. I would also argue he should extend it to Nord Stream 2, which we have urged him to. There are 15 additional companies that Congress mandated sanctions on. But this is a step in the right direction because, Jim and I were around, we were trying to determine what's the role of the federal government in terms of offensive capability, that's DoD, defensive, the civilian interface, we put that at DHS, created CISA. The missing piece here has been the international piece. What is acceptable in international cyberspace? What are the norms and standards? And I think the first idea is to work with our NATO allies, our European partners, and our other allies in terms of what is acceptable and what's not. Obviously, a destructive attack, shutting down things like the power grid, I think we'd have very broad consensus that that's unacceptable and that there will be consequences. one thing I know as a federal prosecutor, if there are no consequences, then bad behavior continues. And I think the bad behavior we've seen out of China and their theft of intellectual property that NSA Director Keith Alexander described as the largest transfer of wealth in human history. You had the Houston consulate in my home state shut down because of the theft of biomedical research at Texas Medical Center, including the vaccine. And then a Texas A&M professor indicted for espionage because he was giving the Chinese NASA data. We have given to them a lot of technology, and what we haven't given to them, they've stolen through cyber. So I think what this sends is a bold statement that we are going to create an office with an ambassador's position with requisite authorities to respond in kind in proportion to the cyber attacks that are taking place, not only in the United States, but all across the world. And as Jim said, it's kind of a wild west right now. There are no rules of the road. We don't even have a definition of what is cyber espionage or what is an act of cyber warfare. If there's an act of warfare, if a bomb is dropped on, building or a power grid is shut down through kinetic means, we would certainly view that as an act of warfare. But in the cyberspace, it often gets relegated as not as significant for some reason. This really, I think, ups the game. That it is just as threatening, whether it comes from cyberspace. It's still just as much of a threat, and it deserves an appropriate and proportionate response.
Awesome. Congressman Langevin, I want to build on some of the comments you had made and Congressman McCaul had made, and specifically, how do you think the Cyber Diplomacy Act, once stood up, knock on wood, let's hope it passes and passes soon, but how would that help the U.S. and allies actually deter, dissuade, compel, mitigate, or counter some of the principal bad actors in the cyber domain? And I'm very happy Congressman McCaul mentioned NATO. We're not talking about replacing Five Eyes NATO, bilats, and other multilateral treaties and the like. But how would this all come together? And I want to make clear to the viewers here, and I'd be curious if you both agree with this. This is not about ceding any authority. It's actually about elevating the U.S. in conjunction with their allies. We're always going to have the right to respond in whatever means we think is most important. But I'd be curious. We have two real world events playing out right now. How do you think the act itself can help?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's going to put us in a much stronger position on the international stage, where we've kind of been absent in a lot of ways in international policy or rulemaking bodies. And this is going to be reasserting ourselves influenced with a high-ranking ambassador-level position, representing the nation and our interests, on the international stage with an appropriate bureau to back up that person with the personnel and the expertise to, again, effectively help with the rulemaking and norm setting. So obviously, the sooner we do this, the better. And coordination is not easy. It takes time to develop relationships and to build muscle memory about what to do in the wake of an incident. We don't yet have that muscle memory built in. We're still kind of doing it on the fly. You can think of the international norms that have been set on the high seas or international airspace and that type of thing. They're second nature now, and they're well established, well respected by various nations around the world. We don't really have that muscle memory yet for cyberspace norms and rules of the road. In general, in cyberspace, if you're trying to figure out what to do once the incident has started, in a lot of ways, it's far too late. So the Cyber Diplomacy Act is going to ensure that we have the personnel and the processes to get our partners and our allies comfortable with attribution and willing to take action sooner. And just by way of example, why does that matter, and how can it be done quicker? Well, You just look at the Skripal incident. Remember that the poisoning in Great Britain. After that poisoning, we got with our allies 30 countries in 30 days together to basically collaborate, share their intelligence, and I say and identify that's the Russians, and that's unacceptable behavior. Well, that's the kind of speed that we need to get to. Today's announcement by the Biden administration, those sanctions and calling out the Russians for, again, bad actors, bad actions that they took, is great. I have to say, though, I'm a bit disappointed that we aren't seeing the same upswell that the Skripal or Navalny attacks caused. And that tells me there's still a lot of work to do. You think of how much stronger those sanctions would have been, and the response would have been if we were there with a number of our allies shoulder to shoulder saying, that the Russians crossed the line again, and we're going to hold them accountable. So, it's just also important to understand that the role of capacity building. A lesser noticed announcement today is that the U.S. will be holding trainings in Europe on norms of responsible state behavior. I think that's welcome news, both for us and our allies. It's an incredibly important step, but we need personnel, and we need resources to backstop it. And it can't just be a one and done effort. It's got to be something that's ongoing and sustained.
Being respectful of time, I want to throw two very quick questions out. But both of you would agree that it's not only Russia. China should also there should be cost imposition on some of their behavior as well. Obviously,
Absolutely.
different approaches, different actors. What dissuades or deters one may not the other. But I just wanted to get that. And I'm really glad you mentioned joint attribution, because I think the Cyber Diplomacy Act can help facilitate and enable what has been happening. It's sort of been like pickup basketball right now. We just get our buddies who are available, and they join us in joint attribution. But this could codify some of that, I think, and maybe even lead to joint responses where appropriate. But Congressman McCaul, because I know we've got votes coming, you sponsored the legislation that stood up the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, at DHS. How would you see this role and an ambassador role coordinating and we're not creating new turf here. We're actually syncing up, I think. But I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that particular question. And Congressman Langevin, because I'm worried about time after Congressman McCaul, same thought on the National Cyber Director and how you see this new bureau and this ambassador for cyber fitting into the broader interagency. So Congressman McCaul, over to you quickly. And I know we're coming at the end of our time soon.
Well, yeah, and Jim and I were co-chairs of the CSIS.
That's right.
Report that came out so many years ago. It was one of the first. That's when we it wasn't cool to be in cyber. I think it's a little more cool today, Frank. Right? So
pretty cool.
So Jim and I were just kind of ahead of our time, I think.
People don't look at it so funny anymore. With we talk about it as an important issue.
I mean, Jim and I strongly recommended an office within the White House, a cybersecurity coordinator within the White House. It was probably our top recommendation. I was, I must say, disappointed in the last administration that was taken out. And I'm pleased to see that the current administration has now elevated that once again, because it is so important. I think CISA and the role of the ambassador would be complementary in nature, in the sense that CISA could share with this ambassador what the current threat landscape is. What are the threats coming in from, as Jim mentioned, about 80% of these threats are in the private sector. So CISA works very well to get this threat information. And with our mandatory breach notification law, we'll be getting more of this threat information that we can actually scrub to protect the companies and their duty to their fiduciary stockholders. And they would in turn share what the threats are, what the attribution is, and then the ambassador can make the decisions on presidential recommendations for things like sanctions, working with other nations like our allies and Five Eyes in terms of what the appropriate standards of conduct are in this space. Right now, we currently have nothing. And you mentioned China; they've gotten away with this for decades without any consequence at all. And this is that's why I believe it's so significant to elevate this to the international stage, where we can finally hold countries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, when they perpetrate these cyber attacks, have some standard norms in the international community to hold them accountable. And
Awesome.
one last thing, I think we've got to have more leadership in the United Nations. My 5G bill standard settings. The idea that China was going to take over the intellectual property organization within the United Nations, we have seen them systematically take over key positions in the United Nations, and I believe that the U.S. and our allies need to start taking some of these positions back.
Well said. Well said. I heard the boat bell all the way from here in the plane, so I know we're coming near the end of our time. I just want to underscore one thing on that cyber deployment. So another entity we haven't discussed is FBI, and their ALATs, or their attaches, their cyber attaches, are so critical as well. And this will just empower, not undermine some of those roles. Congressman Langevin, you and I have a big fight in on the National Cyber Director. There's been some great news, including a nominee. I think both of us and Mr. McCaul, hopefully you would agree, Chris Inglis is good of a candidate as you can get. But I'd be curious how you see it fitting together as well.
Yeah, thank you.
And you're going to have the last word,
I agree with many
unfortunately.
of the comments that you made and that Michael McCaul was just mentioning. And yeah, so as Mike mentioned, he and I have been at this now for more than a decade, going back to the CSIS Commission. We were calling for a director's position with a position with real teeth, policy, and budgetary authority that can really reach across government and compel departments and agencies to step up their game and do more on cybersecurity. And I guess it's proof that even good ideas, it takes a while, but finally it can get done, and that's certainly what happened. We were able to I was able to get with my colleagues' support, get the amendment into the National Defense Authorization Act last year, and finally got it through the House and the Senate, and actually took an override of a presidential veto to enact the NDAA this past year. But it got done under the wire just in time. But as you mentioned, yeah, I'm incredibly excited that Chris Inglis, one of our fellow cyberspace Solarium Commission members, has been nominated by the president to be the inaugural National Cyber Director. I've said before, and I've said now, he's the right person at the right time for the job, just hands down. The NCD is responsible for helping to develop and coordinate implementation of the National Cyber Strategy. This obviously has international components to it. But I look at the NCD as a way to help the various departments and agencies stay on the same sheet of music, and that hasn't been the case in the past. I'll say that U.S. Cybercom is doing a great job on its Hunt Forward mission to help secure allied networks and also to show how military cyber can be a force promoting stability. I know that our allies like when that U.S. Cyber Command comes in and works with them to do threat hunting and really defending forward, or like Chris Inglis likes to say, defending early. I think that's essential. CISA and the FBI are working closely with their counterparts on cert-to-cert sharing and international law enforcement investigations, respectively. And then finally, NCD is a check to make sure that these efforts are being responsibly resourced and that all the oars are pulling in the same direction. We're going to have somebody directly advising the president to make sure that it's an advocate for the right resources and policies that are in place and that they're happening. So, Chris won't be there to supplant the Bureau's judgment by any stretch with his own. Instead, he'll be there to help ensure synchronicity across the many parts of government involved in cyber as an ally to the head of the new Bureau at state.
Congressman McCaul, Congressman Langevin, the tyranny of time requires I be a bit of a tyrant here. I wanted to say thank you. I mean, two great Americans committed to our national security, fighting the good fight. It's taken some time, but we're seeing some progress. I want to say thank you, not only for all the work you do, but I'm also privileged to consider both of you friends. So thank you. Keep up the good fight, and onward and upward.
Thanks so much, Frank.
Thank you.
Very good.
Great seeing you.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.